Yes, good morning to all. Yesterday in the last class we have discussed about the introductions of biology. The study of living organism is called as biology, and we divided the living organisms into two categories very simply: plants and animals. Study of plants is called botany, and study of animals is called zoology. So that is about the introduction, and I think you can follow the English which I am following. And today we can go to the first chapter. I think you have seen the classes in the Victor's channel, and I am starting the same chapter for the first time. After some time we can switch on to another chapters. First of all, I am starting the first chapter, biological classification. See, biological classification. And listen very carefully. This is the first chapter in botany. Biological classification. What do you mean by biological classification? And the history of classification and the groups of living organisms. Come the first chapter. And see, the meaning biological classification means classification of living organism is called biological classification. You see, classification of living organism or systematic grouping of living organism is called biological classification. See, systematic grouping of living organism is called biological classification. See, living organisms are thousands and thousands in number. You see, starting from the smallest bacteria to the largest animal or plant, thousands of living organisms are there. They are with different characters. Characters of living organisms are entirely different. Each living organism, plants are different, animals are different, fungi are different, bacteria are different. So living organisms are with thousands of living organisms are there. They are with different characters. So these living organisms are. It is very difficult to study the living organisms without taxonomy or without classification. So, living organisms are classified. Classification means grouping. Remember the word grouping. Classification means grouping of living organism. And see, living organisms are grouped into different groups based on similarities and differences. You have seen that living organisms, animals are grouped into different groups. You studied in your school syllabus. For example, mammals are there, amphibians are there, reptiles are there, birds are there. Like that, animals are grouped into different groups. Similarly, plants are also grouped. Algae are there, fungi are there, pteridophytes are there, bryophytes are there, gymnosperms are there, angiosperms are there. Like that, plants are also grouped into different groups. Such grouping of living organisms is called classification or biological classification. See, grouping. What is the meaning of group? What is the meaning of grouping? Making group is called grouping. Suppose the first year you are totally 240 students are there. You are grouped into 3 groups or 4 groups. A class with 60 students, B class with 60, C class, humanities group, like that. We are first year students are grouped into, classified into 4 classes, 4 groups. Similarly, all living organisms are grouped into different groups. That grouping of living organisms is called what? Biological classification. And grouping or classifying living organism, it is in a systematic manner. There is a system for that. First comes protozoa, the animal kingdom. First comes the protozoa, then last comes the mammals. So there is a systematic order from simple to larger. Protozoa are the simple organisms. Mammals are the complex organisms. In the plant kingdom, alga, soft organisms, small organisms are algae. Then comes the last angiosperms, large trees are coming in. So comes the algae, then bryophyte, then somewhat large pteridophyte, then somewhat like that large. And so living organisms are grouped in a systematic manner, in a particular manner. That systematic grouping of living organisms is called a biological classification. Can you understand what I am explaining? Grouping of living organisms is called a biological classification. And the branch of biology which deals with the classification is called as taxonomy. See, the branch of biology which deals with the grouping of living organism, classification of living organism is called a taxonomy. I think you study the classification, the details of branches of biology in zoology, or like some other chapters will study like that. So anyhow, branch of biology which deals with the classification of living organisms is called a taxonomy. So taxonomy or classification is the grouping of living organisms, because living organisms are numerous in number. They are with different characters, so we cannot study the characters easily. So the living organisms are grouped into different groups. That process is called a systematic grouping of living organisms, is called a biological classification. And the classification of living organisms is based on 2 points. See, the classification is based on 2 points. One point is the similarity, and second point is the differences. So classification is based on similarity. What is similarity? Similar characters are called similarity. Different characters are called differences. See, similar organisms comes under one group. See, animals which are moving by air, flying animals are coming under which group? Birds. Animals, milk producing animals are called as mammals. Like that, organisms breathing by gills are called as, living in water, breathing by gills are called as fishes. Creeping animals are called reptiles. So animals with the organisms with the similar character comes under one group. Different characters comes under different group. So classification of living organism is based on similarities and differences. Then, what is the purpose of classification? Why living organisms are classified? The answer is that the classification helps in the easier studying of living organism. See, classification helps the easier studying of living organism. We can easily study the living organism. How? Just I am saying a word. For example, birds. I say a term birds. You may remember bird-like animals. Flying by air, have a beak in front, you can identify it is a bird. Just I say the group fishes. In your mind, a diagram will come. Fishes, because living in water, respiring by gills and moving by fins, like that. So animals are with similar character, they are classified. So classification help in the easier studying of living organisms. See, like organisms are classified, that branch of biology which deals with the classification is called a taxonomy. So, I am just reviving once again, the systematic grouping of living organisms is called a biological classification, and the branch is called as taxonomy. And classification means grouping. Grouping means producing group, and the classification is based on similarities and differences. And see, this is the introduction related to biological classification. Then comes the history of classification. History of classification. Who started the classification? When classification started? So comes to that. That is going to the Vedic periods. Actually, the classification taxonomy is a new branch, but classification of living organisms started in the Vedic periods. You know what is Vedic periods? When Vedas originated in India, 2000 years ago, there are two persons, one called as Charaka and Susruta. You know that we studied Charaka, and another called as Susruta. They lived in the Vedic periods, Vedas originated in India. And they wrote very famous books called as Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita in Sanskrit. And you know Charaka, he is called as father of Ayurvedic medicine. You study in your school syllabus. Charaka is called as father of Ayurvedic medicine. He wrote a famous book in Sanskrit about plants that is called Charaka Samhita. And he explained about 5,000 plants in that Charaka Samhita, because you know the Ayurvedic medicine is related to completely based on plants, medicinal plants. So for that Ayurvedic medicine, he wrote a famous book called as Charaka Samhita. In that Charaka Samhita, he wrote the characters of 5,000 plants were explained in Sanskrit. Second attempt comes by Sushruta. You know Sushruta. He wrote a famous book called Sushruta Samhita. And this person is called father of surgery. You remember that? Father of surgery is the person Sushruta. And you remember that 2000 years ago in India there is a practice of surgery. Surgery was not going to British medicine. That also belongs to India. That is our tradition. 2000 years ago, you can remember that there is no science and technology has not been so much developed. There is no microscope, nothing is there. But 2000 years ago in India, this person called as Sushruta conducted surgery. You can remember the history of medicine in India, what happens. So anyhow, there are two persons lived in the way 2000 years ago. That person wrote Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, father of Ayurvedic medicine and father of surgery. They made the first attempt to classify the living things. First of all, plants were classified by these two persons, Charaka and Sushruta. Remember all these books, etc. Then, after that, in the first century, we come to the first century. A person called as Aristotle. I think you remember the name of Aristotle. Who is Aristotle? He is called as a father of biology. Aristotle, he classified living things in the first century based on external characters. External characters. What do you mean? External characters, outside characters. See? Outside characters are considered. See? By outside character, not looking the internal character or anatomy. By looking the external characters, living organisms were classified into different groups by the person called as Aristotle. He is called as the father of biology, lived in first century. He made the first attempt to classify living organisms. And the classification explained by Aristotle in the first century, he classified living organisms based on, you remember that, external characters, outside characters, and such classification explained by Aristotle is called as artificial classification, artificial system of classification. See, this is not natural, this is artificial system. Examples are there in the textbook. I am giving another example to understand the things easily for you. So the first century, Aristotle classified, father of biology, classified the living organisms into different groups based on external characters. So the classification based on external character is called what? Artificial system of classification. Because that is based on outside character, external character, morphological character. Morphology means outside character. That is called as artificial system of classification. And this classification, for example, he classified the plants into three groups. See, he classified the plants into three groups based on height of the plant. For example, he classified the plants into 3 groups. That is called, based on the height, they are classified into herbs, shrubs, and trees. See, plants were classified into 3 groups called as herb, shrub, and trees. Based on what? Based on the height of the plant. Based on the height of the plant, they are classified into 3 groups: herbs, shrubs, and trees. But even by herb, small plants are called herb, like osimum or small plant. Somewhat large plants are called as shrub, similar to our hibiscus tree or rose plant. Somewhat larger plants are called trees. This is a classification based on the height of the plant. Height is an external character, outside character. So plants were classified into 3 groups: herb, shrubs, and trees. This is artificial, not correct classification. Based on animals are classified into 2 groups. Some are called as winged animals, some are called as wingless animals. See, the living animals are classified into winged animals and wingless animals. Based on what? Based on presence or absence of wings. Animals with wings are called winged animals. Animals without flying animals are called wingless animals. And this is based on external character, presence or absence of wing only considered. So such a classification, winged and wingless animals. Whether it is right classification? No, because winged animals, for example, bat is a winged animal, bird is a winged animal, butterfly is a winged animal. See, these 3 are winged animals. But it is a wrong classification because bat comes under mammals, birds are coming under birds, butterflies coming under some other groups. So like that, it is different. So living organisms are classified by Aristotle by looking the external character. Such a classification based on external character of living organism is called as artificial classification. So the classification proposed by Linnaeus was artificial. Why? You have to write that. The classification proposed by Linnaeus was artificial because this classification is based on external characters of living organism. It is not a correct classification. For example, these examples are there. And in textbook some other examples are there. You can write that example also. So this was the first classification in the field of taxonomy in 1st century. That is years back. But at that time, science and technology has not been so much developed. So the classification is the first classification by the father of biology. So that is about the classification in the 1st century. Then, after many years, in the 17th century, a person called as Carolus Linnaeus. In the 17th century, you pronounce as Carl Linnaeus, but we write as Carolus Linnaeus. He classified the living organisms into 2 kingdoms. He classified living organisms into 2 kingdoms, 2 groups, 2 kingdoms, and one called as plant kingdom and another called as animal kingdom. Complete living organisms were grouped into 2 groups, plant kingdom and animal kingdom. This was a classification proposed by Carl Linnaeus in 17th century. He is called as father of taxonomy. I think you can follow the lessons. Father of biology was Aristotle. He was called as father of taxonomy. He classified the living organisms into 2 kingdoms, plant kingdom and animal kingdom. Plant kingdom and animal kingdom. And this classification where the living organisms are grouped into 2 groups is called the 2 kingdom classification. And what are the 2 kingdoms? Plant kingdom and animal kingdom. And plant kingdom include all plants. It includes plants. Then it includes bacteria. And it includes fungus. You know fungus. Fungus is a type of living organisms. And animal kingdom include unicellular animals and multicellular animals. Unicellular and multicellular animals comes under animal kingdom. So this was the basis of taxonomy. The Carl Linnaeus was called as father of taxonomy. He classified the living organism into two groups, plant kingdom and animal kingdom. Plant kingdom include plants, bacteria and fungus. Animal kingdom include unicellular and multicellular animals. What do you mean by unicellular animal? Animals with a single cell in the body are called unicellular animals. Animals with numerous cells in the body are called multicellular animals. So this is a classification, two kingdom classification proposed by Carl Linnaeus in the 17th century. So the classification and details we can discuss in the next class. What are the mistakes of classification? This classification was not a correct classification. Mistakes are there that we can discuss in the next class. I think you can follow the lessons very carefully. So I can understand the lessons. I can understand my English because I am using simplest English. Other languages are not possible in the class. So I just rewind the things. So the classification, the systematic grouping of living organisms is called a biological classification. The grouping of living organism is based on similarities and differences. It helps in the easier studying of living organism. The branch of biology is called taxonomy. The classification goes to Vedic periods, Charaka and Sushruta. Then comes to 1st century Aristotle classification, artificial classification based on external characters, height of the plant, etc. Then comes to 17th century father of taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus, classified into two kingdoms. So that is okay for today. Then remaining the classification of two kingdom, what are the mistakes, we can discuss in the next class. I will send the notes later on. When you are listening the class, you write the important points in the margin so you can understand it very easily. I will give the notes later on. Okay, thank you.